The apple trees along Copper Creek Road had been picked clean by the birds, nothing left on the gnarled branches but a few shriveled skins the frost had turned to paper. Clara Hadley stood at the edge of the road and looked at them anyway, her fingers working the frayed cuff of her coat sleeve the way a person does when they need something to do with their hands. It was the 4th day of October. She had been walking since before sunrise. Her boots were good boots, or they had been, once. Her father had bought them the year she turned 16, the year before the fever took him. They had carried her through 2 harvests, a wedding and a funeral since then, and now the left sole was speaking its mind with every step, a soft, wet slap against the hard-packed Colorado dirt that announced her arrival to no one in particular. The road was empty. The mountains to the west were not. They rose in long blue ridges above the valley, indifferent and permanent, the kind of landscape that made a person feel very small and very mortal at the same time. Clara was 23 years old, and she was alone in the way that has a specific weight to it, the aloneness that comes not from solitude but from loss. Her husband, Thomas Hadley, had been dead 11 months. He had been a decent man, a careful man, and it turned out he had also been a man with a gambling debt he had never once mentioned to her in 2 years of marriage. She had discovered both truths on the same afternoon, the goodness and the secret, when his creditors came to the door 3 days after the burial. They had taken the furniture first, then the equipment, then the house itself. She had left Durango with a single trunk and her mother's silver thimble, because even creditors leave a woman her thimble. She had a cousin in Montrose who had written to say there might be work at the schoolhouse. She had been walking toward that letter for 4 days now. It had rained on the 2nd day. Her coat had not recovered. The sound of a wagon reached her before she saw it, the steady creak of a loaded rig and the heavy, unhurried percussion of 2 draft horses working a grade. She stepped to the side of the road without thinking, habit and pride working together to make her appear as though she were simply a woman pausing to admire the view. She stood straight. She kept her chin level. The wagon came around the bend and slowed. The man holding the reins was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years past it, with the kind of face that Colorado sunlight carves over a long acquaintance. His jaw was square and unshaven, his shoulders wide under a canvas coat the color of dried sage. He had dark eyes, the particular shade of brown that does not warm easily or quickly, but holds its temperature a long time once it does. He looked at her on the road. He looked at the trunk sitting in the mud behind her, which she had set down to rest her arms. He looked at her boots. He pulled the team to a halt. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply sat up on that wagon seat with the reins loose in his hands and took the full measure of the situation in front of him, with the same quiet attention a man gives to weather or broken fences, things that require accurate assessment before any action is useful. Then he climbed down. He did not come all the way to her. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough to speak at a normal volume, far enough that she had room to make her own decision about what came next. He took his hat off and held it at his side. "That trunk looks heavy," he said. His voice was level, neither warm nor cold, the voice of a man who chose his words the way a carpenter chooses lumber, for fit and function. "I manage," Clara said. "I don't doubt it." He glanced down the road ahead of her, then back. "That's another 9 miles to the next town. Road goes through the creek ford at Miller's Crossing. Creek's been running high this week." She had not known about the ford. She kept her face still so he would not know she had not known. "I have a ranch up this road," he said. 4 miles. I need to put these supplies away before dark." He looked at her directly, and there was nothing in his eyes that made her afraid. There was only the same honest, practical attention he had given the whole situation. "I could use an extra pair of hands in the morning. I've got more canning left than one person can finish before the first hard freeze, and my records are 3 months behind. I'm not looking for charity to give, and I don't imagine you're looking for charity to take." He paused. "I'm offering work. You could ride up with me now, sleep in the house proper, and see whether the arrangement suits you in the morning." Clara looked at him. She looked at the road ahead. She thought of the creek ford, the high water, the left sole of her boot. "What kind of records?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, the outline where a smile would go on a face that had gotten out of the habit. Livestock ledger, supply accounts, correspondence with the cattle broker in Denver. "I can run a ranch," he said, "but I have never been a man for paperwork." "I can read and cipher," she said. "I taught school for a year before I was married." "I know what school teachers earn," he said, and named a figure that was fair enough. She did not argue with it. "All right," Clara said. "My name is Dolan Marsh," he said, and came forward to pick up her trunk. She did not tell him to leave it. That was its own small conversation, and they both understood it. His name was on the ranch gate in iron letters, Marsh, bent into the shape of the word by someone who had taken care with it. The house came into view as they came over the last rise, and Clara read it the way she read everything, quickly and completely. It was a solid house, 2 stories, built of good timber, and it was suffering from the particular neglect that comes when a capable person has simply run out of hours in the day. The front porch railing had a loose post. The kitchen garden was overgrown at the edges. The windows were clean, she noticed. A man who kept his windows clean was not a man who had given up. He had just been outrun by the work. He pulled the team up to the barn and she climbed down before he could come around to offer a hand, because she had learned that the fastest way to be treated as capable was to behave as though you already were. "Kitchen's through that door," he said, unloading the wagon with the practiced efficiency of a man who lifted heavy things alone every day of his life. "There's wood beside the stove and a larder that's better stocked than the house looks. Help yourself to whatever you need." Clara went inside. The kitchen was big and practical and as organized as a room can be when one person is doing the work of 3. She found flour, salt pork, dried beans, 24 eggs nested in a bowl of sawdust, and 3 kinds of preserves lined on a shelf in descending order by jar size. She found a cast iron skillet that had been seasoned for years, and a Dutch oven that was worth more than the furniture she had lost. She found coffee, good coffee, not the watery kind, and a grinder on the wall. She built a fire in the stove. She put coffee on. She took stock. By the time Dolan Marsh came in from the barn, his hands washed and his coat hung on the peg by the door, there was cornbread in the skillet, and a pot of bean soup, with salt pork and dried herbs, she had found in a tin labeled in careful handwriting on a high shelf. The kitchen was warm and smelled of things that suggested a future. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the stove. He looked at the table, where she had moved the stack of mail and ledger books to one side, and set 2 places with the dishes she had found in the cupboard. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "The fire needed lighting anyway," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He ate. He ate everything in front of him and did not leave a drop of the soup in the bowl, and when he was done, he set his spoon down and said, "That's the best meal I've had in this house in 2 years." "The herbs were already here," she said. "I know," he said. "I just never knew what to do with them." That night, lying in the small but decent room he showed her at the top of the stairs, Clara looked at the ceiling and felt something she had not felt in 11 months. Not happiness. Not exactly. Not yet. But possibility. The specific, fragile sensation of a door that is not yet open but is no longer locked. The next morning she rose before he did and was in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She had already discovered 2 things: the canning, which was indeed substantial, some 40 pounds of late-season tomatoes and another 20 of green beans waiting on the back porch, and the ledger, which was not 3 months behind but closer to 5, and written in a hand that was legible but not always logical. The accounting of a man who understood land and livestock in his bones, but treated numbers as a necessary evil rather than a language worth learning. She had a pot of oatmeal on the stove and a cup of coffee poured when he appeared in the doorway. He looked at the oatmeal. He looked at the ledger she had open on the side of the table. He looked at her. "You've been at the books already," he said. "You told me they were behind," she said. "I wanted to see what I was dealing with." He poured his coffee and sat down. "And you're not in trouble," she said. but you're close enough to it that you should know the shape of it clearly. You sold 70 head at the fall market last year and recorded the sale price correctly, but forgot to deduct the freight fee and the broker's commission before you entered the profit. So your profit column has been wrong for a year. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the figures. You think you have more cushion than you do going into winter. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers she had already begun to correct in pencil. How much cushion do I actually have? He asked. His voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who wanted the true answer, not a comfortable one. She told him. She told him plainly, the way she would have told a student, without softening the arithmetic but without dramatics either. Facts were facts. They were not improved by either panic or pretense. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. What do I do about it? For now, she said. You let me finish correcting the ledger, so we both know exactly where you stand. Then we look at what's coming in this fall and match it against what's going out. She paused. And you let me finish the canning today, because 40 pounds of tomatoes will not wait for bookkeeping. He almost smiled again. The same outline, the same suggestion. You can do both? I can do both, she said. The days that followed had a shape to them that Clara had not known she was hungry for. She canned, and she calculated. She put up 17 quarts of tomatoes and 14 of beans, and a run of apple butter from the old trees behind the barn that Dolan had not thought to harvest, having been short on time and long on other obligations. She reorganized the larder so that the winter stores were visible at a glance. She answered 3 months of backed-up correspondence to the Denver broker in letters that were precise and professional and left no room for ambiguity about what Marsh Ranch intended to sell in the spring and at what price. Dolan read the letters before she sent them. He read them twice, carefully, and then he looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, a kind of quiet recalibration, the look of a man revising his understanding of a situation. You know, he said, I've been writing to Carson in Denver for 6 years. He's never answered inside of 2 weeks. He tapped the letter. He'll answer this one in 4 days. He'll answer it in 3, Clara said, because I told him we were also in correspondence with the broker in Pueblo. Dolan looked at her. Are we? We are now, she said. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a low sound, genuine and a little rusty, the laugh of a man who had not used it in a while, and it transformed his face in the same way that sunlight transforms a landscape, revealing the contours that the shadow had been hiding. The hands came in for the fall gather in mid-October, 6 of them, weathered and laconic and skeptical in the way of men who have eaten bad range cooking for too many seasons to be easily optimistic. They filed into the kitchen the first morning and sat at the long table and waited. Clara put breakfast on that table that silenced every one of them. Eggs scrambled with the last of the summer's dried chives. Salt pork crisped the way it is only crisped when someone is actually paying attention to the skillet. Biscuits that rose the way biscuits rise when the butter is cold and the hand is light. And coffee that tasted like coffee rather than an apology for coffee. The oldest hand, a man named Pete with a white mustache and the hands of a man who had worked cattle since before Clara was born, looked at his plate and then looked at Dolan and said, Where'd you find her? Side of the road, Dolan said. Pete looked at Clara. You got any sisters? He asked. The men rode out laughing, and something in the tone of the whole ranch shifted with them, the way the air shifts before rain, a subtle change in pressure that meant things were about to be different. Clara noticed the small things Dolan did. He repaired the loose porch railing on a Sunday morning without mentioning it, and she only discovered it when she came outside and found it solid under her hand. He brought in extra firewood and stacked it close to the kitchen door rather than at the barn, because he had noticed she was the one using it most. When the temperature dropped sharply one evening and she mentioned, not to him but simply to the room, that she wished she had thought to bring her heavier shawl from the trunk in her room, she came down the next morning to find a wool blanket folded over the back of the kitchen chair she used, the good blanket from the chest in the parlor. She said nothing about any of it. But the next week, the ledger was fully corrected, the correspondence was current, and she began, without being asked, to draft a proper accounting system going forward. Something simple, something he could maintain himself, columns and categories, and a monthly summary page that would tell him at a glance where the ranch stood. She wrote the instructions in the front of a new ledger in her careful, clear hand and left it on the dining table. She heard him in the parlor that evening, turning pages. The trouble arrived on a Thursday, the way trouble tends to do, without announcement and in a form you did not anticipate. It came as a man named Whitfield, who stepped down from a fine black horse in front of the house and walked to the door with the ease of someone who has never had reason to knock apologetically anywhere. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with the well-fed confidence of a man whose problems were always other people's problems. He wore a suit that had no business being in Garnett County, Colorado, and he carried a leather satchel that Clara recognized the shape of without having ever seen this particular one before. She had seen what was inside a satchel like that. She had seen what it could do to a house, a farm, a future. She was at the kitchen window when he arrived, and she watched him speak to Dolan on the porch, watched Dolan's shoulders go the particular way they go when a man is receiving news he has been half expecting and wholly dreading. She watched them go inside to the parlor. She stayed in the kitchen. She went to the ledger. She went to the corrected ledger, the one she had been working on for 3 weeks now. And she also went to the correspondence file she had organized. The letters from Carson in Denver, the new letters from the broker in Pueblo who had responded not in 3 days but in 2, and who had been, as she had suspected, quite interested in the possibility of a spring contract. She listened to the voices in the parlor. She did not need to hear every word. She had grown up in a county where banks worked the same way they worked everywhere, which is to say they profited most from a man's moment of greatest vulnerability. Whitfield was from the Territorial Land Office, not a bank, but the mechanism was the same. There was a grazing lease on the upper pasture, 1,200 acres where Dolan ran his summer herd, and the lease was coming due for renewal at the end of the month. The Territorial Office had received an offer from a cattle operation out of New Mexico, a large operation, the kind that did not so much buy land as consume it, and Whitfield was here to tell Dolan, with great professional regret, that unless Marsh Ranch could match or exceed the competing offer within 10 days, the lease would be awarded elsewhere. Without the upper pasture, Marsh Ranch ran half a herd. Half a herd could not service the existing costs of the property. The math from there was simple, and it went in one direction only. Clara set down the ledger she was holding and picked up a different one. She spread 2 letters flat on the kitchen table. She got out a piece of paper and a pencil, and she sat down and worked through a set of figures that took her 11 minutes to complete because she was careful and she checked her work twice. Then she stood up, smoothed her apron, picked up the papers, and walked into the parlor. Whitfield looked up from the table with the expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of a performance he was enjoying. "Ma'am, this is a private matter between Mr. Marsh," Clara said, and she did not look at Whitfield again. "Your spring contract with the Pueblo broker." She set the letter on the table. 60 head at the current grade A price, delivery by the 1st of April. She set the second letter down. Your renewed inquiry to Carson in Denver, which he has confirmed in writing. 40 head, same terms. She placed her sheet of calculations on top of both. That is 100 head. Committed to contract at prices fixed before any spring market softening. At those figures, your operation in the upper pasture produces enough margin in a single season to cover the renewal on the lease and carry the ranch through the following winter with a reserve. The parlor was very quiet. Dolan was looking at the papers on the table. His face was the face of a man who is watching something happen that he does not yet fully understand but recognizes as significant. Whitfield picked up the calculation sheet. He read it. He set it down. He picked up the letter from Pueblo and read that too. Clara stood with her hands folded in front of her and waited, because she had learned that figures, when they were correct, did not need defending. They needed only to be read. "The New Mexico operation," Whitfield said at last, his tone considerably more careful than it had been 2 minutes ago, "has offered a substantial advance against the first year's lease." "I'm sure they have," Clara said pleasantly. "They can afford to. because they intend to run the upper pasture to exhaustion inside of 4 years and move on. Mr. Marsh has been running it for 11 years at a sustainable rate, which is why it is still worth leasing. She paused. The territorial office, I imagine, has some interest in what the land looks like in 5 years, not only in what the check looks like today. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man reordering his understanding of a situation he had believed to be straightforward. He left an hour later with a 10-day extension and a letter of intent from Dolan Marsh, accompanied by the signed contracts from both brokers, which Clara had organized into a neat packet with the calculation sheet on top, figures clear, handwriting unimpeachable. She heard him right away. She was back in the kitchen, washing the coffee cups from the meeting, when Dolan came in. She kept her hands in the basin because she had learned that it was easier to let a man find his words if you gave him something to look at other than your face. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He had the expression she had seen once before on his face, the morning after she had reorganized the supply accounts, multiplied and deepened. It was not simply gratitude, though gratitude was in it. It was the particular look of a person who has just understood something important about their own life and is quietly rearranging everything else around it. "You knew," he said. "About those broker letters. You set that up." "I set it up 3 weeks ago," she said. The Pueblo contact was a reasonable one regardless. It made sense to have 2 buyers for the spring. "But you knew someone might come." She was quiet for a moment. "I knew the upper pasture lease was in the records as expiring. I knew the New Mexico operations had been moving north. I didn't know a man named Whitfield would come on a Thursday, but I thought it was worth being ready." He crossed the kitchen and stood on the other side of the work table, and she looked up at him and found his dark eyes on her with an attention that was different from anything she had seen in them before. Not the assessing look of the road, not the recalibrating look of the letters. Something older and more fundamental than either. "When I stopped on that road," he said, "I stopped because you looked like a person who needed a practical hand, and I thought I might be able to offer one. That's the honest truth of it." "It wasn't," he stopped. "I didn't expect." He stopped again. He was not a man who reached easily for the right words, and she had come to understand that this was not a limitation. It was a form of honesty. He did not say things until he knew they were true. "I know," she said quietly. "I find," he said slowly, "that I have stopped thinking about what this ranch was before you came and started thinking about what it can be. And in every version of what it can be, you are here. Not in the kitchen," he said quickly, as though this distinction mattered greatly to him. "Not only in the kitchen. At the table, with the ledger, on the land. You see things I don't see. You think ahead in ways I don't think ahead." He looked at her steadily. "I would like you to stay, permanently, as my wife, if you'll have me. I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I am not a young man with flowery speeches in him. But I mean that one as completely as I have ever meant anything." The kitchen was warm. Outside, the first real cold of November was pressing against the windows, the kind of cold that means it, that settles in and stays. Inside, the stove ticked steadily, and the lamp on the table made a small, reliable circle of light. Clara thought of the road, the wet slap of her left boot, the empty apple trees. She thought of the ledger she had rebuilt from disorder into sense. She thought of the parlor, an hour ago, and the look on Whitfield's face when the figures would not give way. She thought of the blanket on the back of the kitchen chair. "Yes," she said, "I will." He exhaled slowly, and the lines across his forehead, which she had assumed were simply the marks of weather and age, eased in a way that made her understand they had also been the marks of a long time alone. "I'm not a quick man," he said. "You should know that going in." "I know," she said. "I've been reading your ledgers. You're thorough, though. And thorough is worth more than quick." This time he did smile, fully and completely, and it was exactly as she had suspected it would be when it finally arrived. It changed his entire face. It made the kitchen feel larger somehow. They were married in early December, on a Saturday, in the front parlor of Marsh Ranch, because the roads to town were iced, and neither of them saw any reason to wait for better weather when the weather inside was already good. The 6 ranch hands stood in their cleanest shirts as witnesses, Pete in the front with his white mustache combed and his hat actually held in his hands rather than simply resting on his knee. Clara wore a dress of blue wool she had made herself in the evenings over the past 3 weeks, because there were some occasions that called for something made with intention, and Dolan wore his dark suit and looked at her with eyes that said everything his mouth was still learning to say. The parson from Miller's Crossing read a short service, and they signed the register, and the hands applauded, and someone had thought to bring a bottle of good whiskey, though no one admitted whose idea it had been. That evening, after the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet and warm, they sat together at the kitchen table with the new ledger open between them, planning the spring. It was not a conventional wedding night. It was better than that. It was the beginning of a genuine partnership between 2 people who had each been running a deficit, she in security and he in foresight, and had found in each other exactly the account they needed. 5 years later, a woman standing in the doorway of Marsh Ranch on a clear May morning would have seen this. A prosperous yard, the fences straight and sound, a kitchen garden that ran in orderly rows clear to the property line, and a pair of children playing near the old apple trees behind the barn. A girl of 4 with her mother's dark eyes, and a boy of 2 who had inherited his father's steady, deliberate way of investigating everything he encountered, including beetles, fence posts, and his sister's opinions. Dolan came up behind Clara and stood beside her in the doorway, a cup of coffee in each hand. He gave her one without being asked. "Carson sent a letter," he said. "He wants to expand the spring contract. 80 head instead of 60. Tell him 75, Clara said, and ask him to hold the price through June. She watched their daughter explain something to her brother with great seriousness. "He'll say yes. He always says yes when I give him a number smaller than the one he named." Dolan looked at her. "You've been doing that for 3 years. "I know," she said. "He hasn't noticed yet." He shook his head slowly, the warm, unhurried shake of a man who has long since made his peace with being regularly outmaneuvered by the person he loves most. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the doorway, while the May morning came fully alive around them, the mountains bright with the last of the snowpack, the creek running clear and full, the land that was theirs stretching away in every direction toward a horizon that continued, as it always had, to hold more future than they could see. "Do you ever think about that road?" he asked. "Where I found you?" "Sometimes," she said. "I almost didn't stop." She looked up at him. "What made you?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard, at the children, at the long reach of the ranch they had built together from neglect and potential and sheer, patient work. "Your boots," he said finally. "The way you were standing in them, like you weren't going to let them stop you." He paused. "I thought a person like that deserved at least a question." Clara looked down at her feet, at the good boots she wore now, solid and dry and entirely undefeated. "It was a good question," she said. And they stood there together in the morning light, holding their coffee and watching their children play, while behind them the house breathed warmly with the sounds of everything they had made of what was there. Sometimes the most important thing we carry isn't in our trunk. It's the quiet certainty that our skills are worth something, even when circumstances have stripped everything else away. Clara didn't wait to be rescued. She built a fire, opened a ledger, and made herself indispensable one honest day at a time. The right person won't ask you to shrink. They'll pull up a chair and ask what you see. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, while leaving behind a little something worth carrying into your own day.